Welcome to SmithWeekly Discussions, an occasional program for our readers and listeners of SmithWeekly Research. Please note this program is a private discussion and everything contained herein is for entertainment and educational purposes only. With that, we hope you're in a comfortable position, along with your favorite beverage, to enjoy the discussion. Before we get into our talk today, we want to say thanks for questions coming from our audience at SmithWeekly, including Cindy W., Dave V., Todd A., and John B. Dr. Keith Barron is on the show today. Keith is CEO and chairman of Aurania Resources, an Ecuador-focused gold, silver, copper exploration company. The company is listed on the Toronto Venture Exchange under the symbol ARU and on the US OTC markets under the symbol AUIAF. The audience might be familiar with Keith's past venture called Aurania Resources, which delineated the Fruta del Norte discovery in southeastern Ecuador, which was bought by Kinross for about 1.2 billion Canadian, of course, now being built out and commissioned by Lundin Gold. Mr. Barron, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. And by the way, it's Aurania. It means, in bad Latin, it means land of gold.
Oh, excellent. You know, I hacked that, Keith, and I apologize, and I should have put my Spanish lingo in here and gotten that correct. I apologize. I'll try to get it right as we go through.
No worries.
So, Keith, take us back to the early geologist days, and perhaps even before that. What attracted you to minerals, and then why did you take it all the way to the publicly listed company stage?
Well, gosh, you know, I've been a geologist for 36 years now. I have a PhD in geology, so I've been around it for a long, long time. This is actually country number 19 for me, living and working, and so it's certainly nothing new to me. I first went to Ecuador in 1998, and it's a bit of a funny story. I won't go through it all with you because we won't have time. But essentially, I went to Ecuador to improve my Spanish because I was living in Venezuela at the time, and Chavez was coming up for election, and my lawyers advised me to get out of Dodge, so to speak, because they thought there would be a lot of fighting in the streets, and lo and behold, there was. And I kind of wondered aloud where I was going to go, and a friend of mine had been to Ecuador to study at a Spanish school, and I thought, hey, why not do that for a month until things settled down? And so that's what I did. I'd never been to Ecuador before in my whole life. I didn't know anything about it except the fact that it lies on the equator, hence the name. But the geology was really, I didn't have a very firm grasp of the geology, though I picked it up very quickly. And lo and behold, ended up creating a company privately in 2001, which was Aurania, and then in 2006 making a massive gold discovery of almost 14 million ounces, and then the company was sold in 2008. I wondered what I was going to do after that, and thought about it for a little while, and decided, hey, you know what? I think I'm going to go back and set up another project. So I went back to Ecuador, but this time I was working with a professor of history who I had met on my very first visit back in '98. And the two of us went out specifically to find two lost gold settlements, lost mines of the Spanish conquistador days, hence the name of our project, which is the Lost Cities Curaçao project. So that's what we ended up doing. We did a paper chase in really all the archives of the world that contain information relating to the age of colonialism in South America. So we spent a couple of years in the archive of the Indies in Seville in Spain. We made several trips to the Vatican, and we actually found a book in the manuscript library of the Vatican, written in 1628, which gave very, very good details of how to get to one of the lost cities. And so, based on that, there had been a moratorium on getting new property in Ecuador on the books for 8 years. And so during this 8-year period, this is when I did the research, actually visited the field 5 times with a couple of colleagues. And so when the magic day came, when they released what they called the mining cadastro, the mining registry, and allowed new filings to take place, we were poised and ready at 12:01 at night, while everyone else was at a cocktail party at the Prospectors Convention in Toronto, and bang the coordinates in for 208,000 hectares, roughly, well, more than 500,000 acres. And we got the whole thing. Everyone woke up next morning and they said, "Good God, what has Barron done?" And that became really the cornerstone property for what we're doing today in Aurania.
Well, you went through a lot, and I won't comment on all of it, but I can tell you I've seen the video series that you put together, and it really is fascinating, the approach and style that you have there. And then answer this one for me. Is there anybody else in this industry, in this sector, that is doing what you're doing on the history side and taking history and applying it towards your projects in Ecuador?
Well, certainly not in Ecuador, but it has been done before in other places in the world. There's one company, I won't mention the name, but they went after looking for gold deposits in the Nubian desert of Egypt, really going back to the time of the Queen of Sheba, mentioned in the Bible, and found some gold deposits. So this is not by any means unique. People have traced back things through the writings of the Greeks and the Romans and found lost mines as well. I think we're certainly the only ones doing it in Ecuador. And in my former company, Aurelian, we actually did find a Spanish working. I found it mentioned in that manuscript from the Vatican years after we discovered it. So it was a place called Condor, and it had been destroyed and abandoned in 1619. But what we found in the field was a squared tunnel that went back for about 100 feet into the hillside, and you could see the pick marks on the chisel marks on the walls. And we knew it was Spanish because the indigenous people and the Inca didn't have anything harder than bronze. So this is obviously done with steel, and it was perfectly squared at the corners, at the top, and but unfortunately, not a lot of gold in the area.
Fascinating. I just don't think in this day that you have companies in this sector that are going back that far and spending the time like you have highlighted with the story of your company that you have going now. And so I just think it's fascinating to see the different style, the different approach, and of course the land package is massive. I'm trying to figure out who has a bigger land package in this sector in Ecuador. I think it's is it yourself or?
I think maybe we're tied for first. But the other company in question has a number of postage stamp pieces. We've got one big contiguous swath of ground with no holes in it. So that's what really distinguishes us. Now, we went into this area and it has no modern database. There has never been a mining company in this area. We know that it was very, very roughly surveyed by Shell Oil back in 1969, but of course they were not focused on minerals. And we've found things on the surface that the conquistadors would certainly have never dreamed of. So now it's finally starting to yield up its riches, and gosh, we've got a lot of work ahead of us, but we've made a lot of strides so far.
Well, certainly fascinating. Well, I'd take a crack at the Egypt company you mentioned, but I'll save that for later just for the sake of time. So
Yeah.
how do you view natural resources, environment, and mining today? What's kind of your big picture view from your side?
Well, the population of the world is growing every hour of every day, and people need minerals to live a modern lifestyle. And in places like India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, parts of China, you're getting a middle class emerging, and the middle class wants consumer goods like everyone else has in the rest of the world. And so that means things like washing machines, air conditioners, television sets, and all the infrastructure that goes to convey electricity to these various places. So I think really what we're seeing now, like for instance in the copper business, copper is a very important commodity for our company because we're finding a lot of it all over the place, and we can talk about that in a second or two. But with the new renaissance of electric vehicles, it doesn't take a person with a PhD to figure out that there is going to be a massive demand for copper in the future. Not just only for electric vehicles, but also for conducting the electricity to all the charging stations that will need to be put in around the world. So this is an incredible thing, and politicians blithely talk about on the TV and sign documents into law saying that there's going to be a requirement after X number of years that we do away with gasoline-driven vehicles. But nobody really thinks about, hey, where is the copper going to come from in those vehicles? An electric vehicle right now, a Tesla 3, has 103 kilos of copper in it versus a conventional gasoline-powered car that has about 25. So we're talking about a massive difference here, and so obviously the copper is going to have to come from somewhere. Some people, the one statistic that gets quoted quite a bit is that going forward we're going to be consuming one escondida every year, and escondida is the largest copper deposit that we have that's operating today. And so we'll be consuming one of those every year. We'll have to find a new one every year going forward. So that's incredible. And on the gold story, I think it's pretty well appreciated that we've reached a situation of what we call peak gold. So from here on out, really the production worldwide is going to be dropping for the foreseeable future. Some of this is due to neglect, companies not spending the exploration, not putting money into exploration as they should have. And, there's a huge time lag between finding a deposit and actually putting it in production and starting to pour ounces. But nevertheless, and taking that out of the equation, a lot of the low-hanging fruits has been picked, has been plucked. The easy deposits on the surface have been found. Most of the world, with the exception of this area where we're working right now, which is a real anomaly, most of the world has already been walked over by many geologists, and mining camps are quite mature. And so you see situations like in South Africa now, which was the world leader in gold production, is dropped, I think, to position number 5 now. I'm not sure, something like that. But this is what's happened. It's gold mines are finite, and at some point the gold runs out, and then you have to go elsewhere and find another one. and it's getting harder and more expensive all the time. So the demand, of course, is still there for gold, and gold has not lost its luster, and it's certainly intrinsically valuable and appreciated by many, many cultures around the world, and will always, I think, be valuable. And today you see a huge rise in the number of central banks that are actually buying gold again, which is a phenomenon that we haven't seen on this scale for a number of years. And they're buying it to really get away from the hegemony of the American dollar. And gold demand is healthy, silver demand is healthy. Silver, of course, is used in electronics, and it's used very much so in solar panels, and that consumption is just going up and up and up. And most of the base metals are also there's healthy not well there's very healthy usage going on. So I'm very bullish about the mining business in future. I'm just very, very glad, and I think blessed that I'm in a piece of property in Ecuador that seems to be so stuffed full of various metals.
Well summarized. I really appreciate you offering us some of your views on that. So let's get to a place that's not so healthy. Where are we today in the natural resource cycle in terms of market sentiment, capital deployment, and pricing of things like base and precious metals?
Well, that's a very interesting question. Just maybe it was yesterday, gold hit an all-time high in Australian dollars. I believe today it's at an all-time high in about 70 different currencies worldwide. It is certainly not at an all-time high in American dollars, and people are focused on that, and I think unjustly so. The Australian companies are making money hand over fist because obviously they're paid in American dollars and their costs are in Australian dollars. And if the Australian dollar is depreciating against the American dollar, they're doing very, very well. And that's the case for a lot of other places like South Africa, et cetera, et cetera. The market for gold equities in Australia is very, very strong at the moment. In Canada, it's a different situation altogether. And part of it is because the investing public is still enamored with cryptocurrencies and with cannabis. And I think both of them have had their day. I think that notwithstanding Facebook talking about bringing in the Libra now, which I think personally is going to be a flop, but that's just my opinion. I think cannabis, we're seeing a lot of consolidation now, and the easy money's already been made. What we need are a couple of nice big discoveries. Gold discoveries would be nice, but they can be anything really in terms of metals to really jumpstart this market again. I always tell people that where we made the discovery with Aurania way back when, that company went from 30 cents to $43. It was a hell of a win for all the investors. And we turned a piece of basically worthless jungle into something worth in excess of $20 billion. It's going to be more than 3% of the GDP when the mine gets going this September, October, and that's an incredible thing. There's nothing out there, nothing else where you can take something that's essentially intrinsically worthless and then turn it into cash, an incredible pile of cash. And this is through the discovery process. I'm not talking about through the mining process. I'm talking about discovery. And that's what my company does. And we're focused on exploration and not on production. Production's a whole different ball game. Of course, there are many companies out there making a lot of money through producing gold. But there are some that are just getting by, and there are some that are not making money. And then it's all got to do with the quality of the ore body and where it is. And well, there's a number of factors. The market still has a ways to go in Canada on the TSX and the TSXV. But I've been through 5 cycles personally since I've been in this business, and it can turn on a dime. And when it does, it starts to move very rapidly and very convincingly.
Keith, when looking at the sector cast of characters, specifically the junior mining and exploration space, what is your view with regards to how these businesses are ran from a professional standpoint? And is it your view that there are a few good treasures in a kind of a wasteland of questionable companies proclaiming to be in the business?
Well, that's more of an observation than a question, but I think it's spot on. There in junior mining, there are companies that we call lifestyle companies, and these are companies that go ahead and let's say that they raise $500,000 in a private placement, and then management might claw back 300,000 of that 500,000 to pay themselves, and they're not really advancing the project anywhere. They're satisfying their lifestyle, and so they can fly first class on jets and so and stay in the best hotels and there's unfortunately a rogue element in this business that does that. I don't pay myself a salary. I own 54% of Aurania, and I'm completely aligned with the shareholders. If the shareholders don't make money, I don't make money, and that's a very, very unique situation. You won't find any other junior out there where the management owns this much of the company. Now, so we run a pretty lean and mean, tight operation, not just on the cost side, but also how many shares we've got out. We've got 34 million shares out and currently, and that's keeping it nice and tight. And there's a lot of companies out there that are they're well into their 100, 150 million shares out, and they might be languishing at 1 or 2 cents. And really, those folks have very little room to maneuver. They've had their day, so to speak, and sometimes it's just through no fault of their own. Their exploration hasn't turned up anything, and in order to stay alive, they've had to do continuous placements that are causing dilution in the company. So there's some people that say playing the junior market is kind of like throwing darts or like gambling. And I really take offense at that. I went to university. I studied very hard. I've got a couple of discoveries under my belt, and you see people who have done it in the business time and time again. For instance, David Lowell, I think he's found 5 mines in his career. The founder of Tech Exploration, Norman Keevil, found 11 mines. And how is it possible that these people can just be so lucky? Well, they're not lucky. They're applying their skills, and they have the know-how and the ability, and they're able to pull it off more than once. So I've fortunately, with my former team at Aurelian, pulled it off once and found a very good gold silver deposit. I think we're poised and ready to do it again, possibly on the gold silver side and also on the copper side.
So you've spent a good deal of time in Ecuador with notable success, as you highlighted. What attracts you to Ecuador, and how much time do you spend there? And why should investors look at investment opportunities with companies like yours in Ecuador? Can you kind of warm them up to Ecuador?
Well, Ecuador for a number of years was until fairly recently, and maybe 2.5 years ago was really when things started to undergo a change. The government was socialist, and so we saw the former President Correa, appear on the podium with Hugo Chavez and Ahmadinejad, a couple of real rogue elements, and certainly that didn't encourage any investment in the company, nor give any confidence to foreign investors. It just put the willies into them, and including myself. And so Correa is now in Belgium. There's a warrant out for his arrest. He can't go back to Ecuador. The last vice president of Ecuador, Jorge Glass, was implicated in the Odebrecht scandal, and he's now facing 6 years of jail. He's in prison, and pretty much all the socialist elements in the federal government have been purged. They're gone. So now we're looking at a government that's centrist and a much more business friendly. A lot of the ministers and the vice ministers went to school in the United States. They've worked for American corporations or European corporations. They have business credentials to their name. This is very, very different from the apparatchiks who were in there before, who were appointees just because of their socialist tendencies. So we've seen a big difference politically. The much hated windfall profits tax on mining was done away with. That's gone. The government has been streamlining the way you go from exploration to exploitation to get your actual physical mining permits. And the proof is out there that Lundin Gold is fully funded. They have 2,000 men on site. Their mill is more than 70% complete now. They're stockpiling from underground, and it's a fantastic thing. That would not have been possible under the former government. And now we've got companies like BHP, like Newcrest, like Anglo American, joint venturing and getting their own projects in Ecuador. So the seniors are back. And people say to me all the time, what's the political risk in Ecuador? And I say, well, geez, if the big companies are there, do you think it's very risky? And I would argue that it's much more riskier in the U.S. right now to have a project, because anything that you get that is close to production in the States, you get a bunch of NGOs coming out and attacking the Bureau of Land Management or Department of Environmental Quality or whoever is given the permits out as a soft underbelly that they can go and attack. And you find that you've got dozens and dozens of court actions that you have to deal with. This is not happening in Ecuador. In fact, a challenge that was made a couple of months ago through the Constitution was shut down by the president. He said, "I'm not going to have less than 1/10 of 1% of the population dictate the rest." The government of Ecuador realizes that their future lies in the extractive industries. They have relied on oil for decades now, but every time they put their budgets together, they get whipsawed by the price of oil because it's extremely volatile. And if they get some copper porphyry mines going, and that's the intention, and some nice gold mines, a copper porphyry mine could have a life of say 40, 45 years, even longer. And this is going to provide a basis and stability to the country that they've never had before. Their number one export is oil. Number two, I think, is bananas. Number three is cut flowers. And number four is shrimp. And heck, how do you build an economy on that? So to have a couple of, half a dozen producing copper mines like we have in Chile right now, in Ecuador would be a wonderful thing for the country, and half a dozen or even a dozen gold mines. There's no reason why it can't happen, and certainly the projects are being found, and there's lots of stuff that's coming to light. It's Ecuador is kind of a bit of the flavor of the month right now, and rightly so.
Well, you can add rum, cigars, and tourism to that bottom tier of that list. No, you're absolutely right. The extractive industry is key, and Ecuador is a key jurisdiction, certainly in South America, and in Central and South America. Ecuador is certainly a highlight among those top destinations in my mind. And you're absolutely right with the United States. There's extreme difficulties, and I can think of a company that has a big deposit in Alaska that is going through that process with the Army Corps right now, and it's going to be very interesting to see how that decades-long battle ensues during this cycle.
Mm-hmm.
Take us back to Aurelian for a moment. Tell us how that developed out, and then tell us about the surprises that you encountered along the way and what key lessons you learned from that experience.
Wow. Well, I started it in January of 2001, and privately. And people said to me that I was completely insane and that the future was in the new era in tech and all the rest of it, and that gold mining and gold exploration was dead. Now, the very first concession that I acquired, I think it was on April the 17th in 2001, and the price of gold was $252. It was almost at rock bottom. And so we really, I thought to myself, gold cannot go much lower. If it goes any lower in price, we're going to see major gold mining companies in around the world going under. So it really was at the very rock bottom. So I had a very large land package that grew over time. It started out, only 400 hectares, but eventually grew it out to 96,000 hectares. It's less than half the size of what I've presently got in Aurania, but nevertheless a very, very large package. We had our ups and downs. Gold exploration doesn't result in a bonanza in the first week. It takes time, and it takes energy, and it takes money to explore these things. So we had a number of early successes, but they ended up falling by the wayside just simply because they weren't large enough to be economic commercial deposits. The deposit that we did find, Fruta del Norte, was actually something that is called a blind deposit. It does not come to surface. So it was buried by over 100 meters of dead rock. But it did have a geochemical expression at the surface. There was an anomaly of arsenic, antimony, and mercury at the surface that we picked up in our surveying. And my chief geologist, Steve Leary, he's back on the project working for Lundin now. He's a New Zealander and very skilled and proficient in epithermal type gold deposits, and recognized the geochemical signature for what it was. And together, him and I convinced the board to to spend the money and put the holes in the ground. The board was actually very reticent to this because there was no gold on the surface, and some of the board members thought it was a complete and utter waste of time and money. So we hit it. I think it was hole 51 that was drilled in 2006. It was the second hole that was maybe the third hole drilled on that target. But, we had a bunch of, I said hole 51, we had a bunch of other holes that were done elsewhere on the project that year that didn't come up with the goods. But when we did connect, it was in a very big way. It was over 100 meters of 4 grams per ton. And the stock immediately took off in price. I think we went from 80 cents to $4 in one day. And then it just kept going because, fortunately, we were very, very blessed. I'm not a supremely religious man, but I think God was certainly looking after us because this is a blind deposit which lies mostly under a sheet of sandstone. It doesn't come to the surface. And we were drilling in a straight line every 100 meters, more or less 300 feet, and putting a hole just in a straight line. And it was just hitting again and again and again and again and again. It could have been faulted east, west, north, south underneath that sandstone cover, and we never would have been able to find it again. But we were able to trace this thing out for a total of 1,300 meters in a line. And we had one drill hole, which I believe is the richest drill hole that anybody's ever drilled ever in the history of mining. It was 250 meters of 35 grand per ton gold. Just fantastic results. And we did a compilation looking at other mines like Sleeper out of Nevada and Midas, and we couldn't find anything actually that compared with a grade like this. So it was an incredible win for us. A lot of my shareholders ended up being millionaires, and gosh, it's a very gratifying and a happy thing to. I visited the site a couple of months ago, courtesy of Lundin Gold, and was able to go underground, and it's just great to see this thing finally starting to come into fruition.
Absolutely fascinating. I think it's great, and I appreciate you sharing some information, and we certainly know the rest of the story with that. Is there anything that you found during that journey that you would change or do differently? Is there something that sticks out in your mind that you want to offer up to us?
Well, there's, exploration doesn't. I said we just progressed in one straight line, putting the holes in the ground, but the actual exploration process and what led us to that target, things never move in a straight line. It's almost fractal. Are there things that I would do again? There were things I spent money on that, in retrospect, I wouldn't again. So every new site, every new prospect is a learning experience, and I also learned from my employees and my peers and colleagues who have seen things elsewhere in the world that look similar. So you have to take all this into account. I think the only thing that we did wrong, we were really a victim of our own success because there had been no royalty established within Ecuador when we made the discovery. And in March of 2000 and let me see, it would have been March of 2008. No, later on in the year. They brought down what was called the mining mandato, and they shut down all activity in the mining sector in Ecuador, including Fruta del Norte, for a year and a half. It was supposed to happen for only a month or two. It ended up prolonged because the government and the bureaucracy couldn't work fast enough, and they were trying to establish a framework for royalties. But what they didn't realize is that by doing this, they did incredible damage to the industry, and almost all of the companies deserted Ecuador. There were rumors that were unfounded going around that the government was going to nationalize us, nationalize other projects in Ecuador, none of which happened. Those were bad old times. And I certainly don't see anything like that ever happening again. People say to me every so often, well, this happened before, will it happen again? Those people who were in government are long gone. And certainly all you got to do is look a little bit north and see what the experience of socialism has done to the country of Venezuela. And certainly socialism is not coming back to Ecuador in any reasonable time frame. I think it's going to be at least several generations before the socialists ever get traction again in government. So I guess that's the only thing that the only misstep we made, being victims of our own success. But now they do have a royalty framework set up in the country, and one of the great things that they have done is that they've designated that 60% of that royalty, which its sliding scale can be 5 to 7%, 60% of that has to go to the local communities. And they're working on legislation right now because the communities are a little bit fearful that they'll never see that money, and it's just going to get swallowed by the general accountancy office in Quito, and go in the federal coffers. Well, they're trying to work out a framework right now by way the local municipalities are going to get the money directly. And this is going to be a real boon to parts of Ecuador, like where we're working, which are really are on the fringes and have been forgotten by society. Very poor communities.
Well, before we get to Aurania, I want to talk to you. I want to ask you one more question. So you're involved with uranium through a listed uranium company. What is your view on uranium today, and what is your position with regards to nuclear power?
Well, I think that in the last year I've traveled to China and I've traveled to New Delhi, and both places you can cut the air with a knife. I've never seen air pollution the way it is, and really the solution to the problem is going to be nuclear. It's not going to be hydro. It's not going to be wind power. It's not going to be solar. The Indians are building new reactors. The Chinese are certainly building a huge number of reactors, and there are more that are on the drawing board. And they have to stop burning coal. Now, in Germany, when right after the Fukushima accident, Angela Merkel, in a very knee-jerk fashion, decided that Germany was going to get out of the business of nuclear plants, and so she immediately announced plans to shut down the plants. And what have they been doing? They've been buying nuclear energy, nuclear electricity from France, and they've been burning soft coal. And this is soft coal is incredibly destructive because it's very sulfur rich and creates acid rain. And I remember back in the 1970s when people were complaining about the burning of soft coal and how it was killing the Schwarzwald, the Black Forest. Well, this is all coming back again, and it's all from nutty extremist politics. There has never been a major loss of life accident with nuclear power, and there's unfortunately, it's always in the media how people glow in the dark and all this kind of stuff, which is all total nonsense. People have this fear of nuclear energy, but it is actually compared with coal, it's much safer. And I think that it really is should be part of the mix of any country's total allocation for energy. It has to be part of the mix. I am bullish on the price of uranium, but it's going to take some time for it to come back. It's just been smacked in the head by the Fukushima incident and the Japanese shutting down all the nuclear power installations in the country. They are one by one coming back online, and so we will we'll see a resumption of the usage of uranium. And of course, China is going to need uranium to power their cities. But the thing is, right now, with the uranium price well under $30, there's no incentive to go out and explore. And really, we need a base price of $70-$80 to kickstart the exploration business again. It will happen in time, and it really is only a matter of time when we go into a deficit position, and the various utilities are going to be fighting to get a hold of uranium. But unfortunately, that's not today.
Well, I appreciate your views on that, and I absolutely agree. We've spent a number of hours and months and years working on this sector since 2017, and I can tell you that I believe that the fund will start next year. So we've got some significant headwinds coming, including a whole new round of new term contracts coming up, certainly starting potentially after this 232 decision that comes up here in a few weeks, potentially by Trump. So I'm absolutely in concurrence with you that the nuclear power is a huge piece of what we need for energy going forward, and uranium has to find its way out of the ground through the fuel cycle and into utilities' hands. And so that's going to be quite a process. So it's going to be exciting to see what takes place over the next 3 to 5 years in the sector. So let's move on to the company. I want to say that the shares have performed exceptionally well since you set up the company and the extensive land package. In fact, if you look at the share price, quite honestly, over the last couple of years, Keith, you'd never know that there's been a lack of sentiment and demand for your company shares, which has been absolutely rare in this market. So well done.
Thank you.
Now, with that, I want to, when you manage a company and set it up for value creation, when you balance things like G&A costs, exploration costs, capital preservation, financings, timing, etc., what are the key parts reflecting on success at the company this far?
Well, it's a bit of a tightrope, but we run a pretty lean and mean operation. We're not in an office building with which would be classed a Class A site in the city of Toronto. We've got a fairly small office here, and I'm not going to say that we don't pay our employees much, but maybe we don't. Certainly, I don't get anything. But it's we keep an eye on the expenses, of course, and not just here, but down in Ecuador as well. And so I think part of our success is certainly not just due to me. It's working with a very dedicated group here of professionals. And I'd like to single out Richard Spencer, who's the president of the company. Richard spent many years working in Ecuador. Prior to Aurania, he was the general manager of Lundin Gold in Ecuador for a number of years, and before that he was working for a company called Gencor out of South Africa, and discovered a lot of the porphyry coppers in the country. So because of that, we both have a lot of on-the-ground experience. We know what has to get done, and we don't have to go through the learning curve because we've already done that. We did that years ago. So we can just really get to it and start to maximize our chances of success for the shareholders. It is a very, very large land package, and that's completely by design because I've learned through working many, many years in the business that when you have a postage stamp piece of property with one or two mineral occurrences on it, the chances of you coming up with something that is going to be big or even simply commercial and economic are pretty slim. It's almost like a Hail Mary thing. When you have a project, though, that has it's multi-commodity, it's different types of ore forming environments like we have, then you maximize your chances of success. So rather than have one or two gold occurrences or gold showings or things to drill, we've got right now over a dozen gold silver anomalous areas that we're investigating, and we found copper now over a distance of 22 kilometers, almost without break. And that's been unprecedented. I don't know of any other company that's done that for maybe 50 years. I say with our project, it's like an embarrassment of riches, and it really is. Now what we need to do is the unusual situation where we have to go through, it's almost like triage in the emergency department in a hospital. We have to select the things that are going to be generate the most bang for the buck for the shareholders and as fast as we can. And so that we're doing it cost effectively and we don't have to experience the dilution in the company. I've learned the hard way, so has Richard, and we're giving it our best shot, and we're finding lots and lots of stuff, which is what we're supposed to be doing. And, I think the odds are extremely good in our favor. And, I'm not just talking out of my hat here. I put $4 million US into the company fairly recently in a rights offering. So I certainly have a lot of skin in the game, and I put my money where my mouth is. I've never seen a project like this in my 36 years of working in the business. It just keeps giving and giving. And I think we're in a very unique position where because the land package is so big and so productive, we've got potential to joint venture parts of it or sell parts of it off and keeping the best for ourselves. We've got a lot of latitude here to do various things.
So tell us about the targets that you've come across at Lost Cities, and then also tell me what you're going to be doing over the next 18 months.
The original premise of the company was to find the Lost Cities, and we've got a couple of things up our sleeve that we'll be talking about fairly soon. A couple of new techniques that we think will speed up the exploration. They're not going to escape us. The methods that we're using right now, the stream sediment work, eventually will find these things, because when you disturb the ground, especially where there's a gold deposit, you're going to leave traces in the drainage, in the streams that can be picked up. And we use a technique, stream sediment work. It's analyzing clay and silt. It's very, very sensitive, and it's the same sort of technique that environmentalists use to find heavy metal pollution in areas where industries have been dumping where they shouldn't be dumping. It's a very, very sensitive technique to find metals, not just gold and silver, but lead, zinc, really the whole gamut. So we've got a lot of stuff. Almost every week, we're generating new anomalies and new things that have to be chased up. The gold cities, the lost cities will come in time. We've only explored 45% of our project right now, so we've still got quite a ways to go. And they're hiding somewhere in there, but we will find them. What are we planning to do in the next 18 months or so? Well, I would really, really like to get some drills out on the copper. And we found high-grade copper and silver on the surface. Starting last October, the geologists started to bring in large chunks of this stuff, and I'm talking about pieces up to maybe a foot across, 2 feet across, bringing, kind of lashed in their backpacks and lashed to their backs, bringing these things and walking 2 days with them. It's incredible feat. I don't know if I would do it, but they're always in competition. These guys, they're trying to outdo each other, which is a healthy competition. Anyway, we found these things. We've been able to trace them back to outcrop where they're actually popping out of the ground, and we've sampled them. And really the next stage is to do some geophysics on them and then get them drilled, because all this stuff we found the surface is in sediments. This is a very, very important thing for your listeners to understand. This is not porphyry-style copper. This is in sediments. So these are bedded rocks, sandstones, and shales. And the kind of grades that we've been finding in these rocks are exceptional: 1%, 5%, 10%, and always with silver, maybe 2 or 3 ounces per ton of silver in each sample. So that's significant. And but this seems to be more or less like a flatline sheet, and we've traced the thing out for 22 kilometers. Now, I'm not saying that it's going to be a mine that's 22 kilometers long, because that's kind of crazy talk, certainly at this stage anyway. But there are going to be hot spots in there where it's going to thicken up, and maybe the grade will be higher, and that's what we have to find, and then pin cushion it with drill holes, because this stuff is oxide copper. It means that you will not have to make a flotation mill and produce a sulphide concentrate to ship overseas to a smelter. We could actually, through a process called SXEW, solvent extraction, electrowinning, produce copper on site. And there already is on the drawing board 3.5 gigawatt hydroelectric project very, very close by. That's already been scoped out by the government, and so it's a fantastic thing that we found here. You find these brilliant green rocks right on the surface. If any geologist had stumbled across these things 5 years, 10 years, 20 years ago, it would all be gone. It all would have been mined out. I like to say that nobody has found something on kind of the size and scope of this stuff since Leopold II was the king of Belgium in the Belgian Congo, which is now the DRC. And I think we've got a similar sort of ore forming environment here, but time will tell. And we have to certainly get some drills on it. So that's what's going to happen. I'm looking at the fourth quarter this year to get some drills on the copper. We will be continuing to drill gold targets as well, and generating a lot of new targets as well from our stream sediment work.
Well, it sounds like it's going to be some exciting times ahead. And you mentioned the DRC and some of the work that's going on over there with Robert Friedland and so forth. And it really does sound what you have going here is highly attractive. So I want to talk a little bit about, go back to company structure for a moment. Is there any other key management that you'd like to share with us and talk about? And then also, can you, we know you're a big shareholder, but are there some other key shareholders you'd like to mention that are on the roster?
Um, well, let me see. I think an important part of our company is our corporate social responsibility group. And, in terms of risk on the project, there's geological risk, there's political risk, there's social risk. I think the social risk for us is perhaps the greatest thing. We do have a lot of indigenous people, well, not a lot, but small villages of indigenous people living on our concessions. And before any of our exploration people go into the project, we send our CSR people in their corporate social responsibility people in to engage with them, explain what we want to do. And sometimes we're told, no, we don't feel comfortable with you people coming in. And it may take several visits. Quite often they'll see us working with people from the adjacent community. And the way to demonstrate transparency to the local stakeholders is to work alongside them. And then they certainly see that you don't have horns sprouting out of your head. And so it's important to engage with them. And look, their descendants have been there for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and we're the new kids on the block, and certainly it's only right that we talk to them and engage with them and be very, very respectful of both them and their society and their culture. So that's what we do. So I want to single out our CSR team, which I think is extremely important to the health and the going forward for the company.
Well, I wanted to highlight, Keith, too, as you covered it, because it was something I was going to ask. Because I think that I suspect that the company has a very good setup going, and you have to start the social work right out of the gate, even though it's going to be a process that'll develop over many, many years. And I think you've nailed that. So the connection with the local community and the connection with the government in a place like Ecuador is absolutely a real key factor and kind of a cornerstone. My other part of my question is on the shareholder roster, was there any other key
Oh,
shareholders
yes.
that you wanted to mention?
Well, before I answer that, I just want to say, there are people out there who consider CSR work to be fluff. I am diametrically opposed to that kind of discussion, that kind of talk, because I've seen how things can very easily go sideways. And besides, we don't spend a huge amount of money of the companies on CSR projects. I have a private foundation which assists and helps with health and education initiatives for the indigenous people. And we do a number of things that really would not be appropriate to be done with the investors' money. Now, in terms of shareholders, I guess I could say after myself, probably the largest shareholder would be Robert McEwen. I think he has about 7%. And he's the founder of Gold Corp, and of course he runs McEwen Mining. He's a good friend, and he's been a solid supporter of us. Likewise, he doesn't take a salary from his company, so I've taken a bit of a leaf out of his book. And then from then on, there's a number of smaller holdings of individuals, some family offices, and and a couple of small funds.
No, that's great, and I didn't know that Rob was in there, and certainly good to hear some of that different mix of the shareholder roster there. I want to move on to another question, and we're almost wrapped up here. Is there a desire at the company to look outside of Ecuador to diversify a project pipeline? And then also, you mentioned JV, which was starting to pop into my head because we've seen some other JVs start up in the country. Tell us about any JV potential if you're open to that, and then also, what about that pipeline potentially outside of Ecuador, or do you feel like you've got your hands full?
Well, I think we've got our hands full pretty much right now. Though, if something should pop up, which is just too irresistible to walk away from, I'm always open to make money for the shareholders. So, we'd have to take a hard look at it. But nevertheless, it is a massive land position. It's expensive to explore it. And we want to really realize its full potential. At some point, it's going to be too big for us, and I would like to spend other people's money, and if we could have a situation where we have a carried interest, I don't know, let's say 25, 30% carried interest, whatever we can negotiate up to either a production decision or a reach of nameplate capacity, or who knows what, whatever the parameters are. But that would be a great thing. Otherwise, we look forward to a lot of, well, not a lot, but further dilution in the company. That will come, but we have to create the value. We have to create the value and get the share price up. So when we are taking dilution, we're not pushing as much paper out to the market each time, and that's the plan. It's very, very simple. It's the sort of plan that any junior miner should be following. But we think we got the tiger by the tail here, and I know for a certain fact that the majors are watching us. They love the fact that we've got this huge land package, and the fact that with very minimal effort we're starting to make discoveries. So it's a fantastic piece of real estate.
Well, I would hope some of the other CEOs and maybe some of the folks that might be a CEO of a junior mining company that listen to this take your words of advice, because I think it often gets missed and messed up. At the end of the road with Aurania, tell us what you'd be satisfied with as a final product coming out of this company.
When Aurelian was sold, we got the value for Fruta del Norte, but we had made over 30 bedrock gold discoveries, and we just had discovered a number of porphyry coppers as well, none of which we got paid for. A lot of those peripheral targets now are joint ventured between Lundin Gold and Newcrest. So Lundin's getting the benefit of them, but we didn't get the benefit. We just simply didn't move fast enough and get the job done. That's not going to happen this time. Certainly, this company is firmly run by myself and together with Richard. We've got a very, very different board from the Aurelian days. None of the former people from Aurelian are around in the management. It's, I guess, a new broom sweeps clean. So I think I've learned a lot of lessons, not just from dealing with the government or dealing with the geology or everything, but also dealing with people and dealing with markets. So I don't necessarily want to see a repetition of what happened before. We did get a very nice price for Aurelian, but it went for $60 US, or $60 Canadian per ounce. The same company, Kinross, turned around several months later and paid $1,000 per ounce in the ground for Tasiast in Mauritania. So I think really we should have got a lot more money for it. I worked very hard to bring a white knight in, and unfortunately it didn't happen. So, this time around, I'm going to see to it that we get the maximum bang for our buck.
Well, it sounds like you've set the bar pretty high, Keith. So you've got your work cut out for you. And I think if there's someone who might be able to get there, it could be you. So there are a handful of other names in Ecuador advancing projects. Why should investors be looking at your company as their vehicle? What would you say to potential investors?
Well, when Aurelian made its discovery, and just going back to that again, we didn't have a lot of shares out. I think we only had 29 million, and that's one of the reasons why it popped so much. Now, having not that many shares out can be a double-edged sword because you don't have a lot of liquidity. You can gap down as well as gap up. But certainly when you have a nice discovery, and certainly Fruta del Norte was world class, it can gap up very, very fast and go, huge. So I think that, well, gosh, it'd be nice to do that again. It's a hard act to follow. And in the words of Mark Twain, history doesn't often repeat itself, but it often rhymes. So I'm just hoping that we can do it again, and make a whole load of money for the investors. Now, I am not a person who wants to go out and create a new mining dynasty and all that nonsense and put the thing in production. Certainly, that's not anywhere on my radar right now. The idea would be to get it to a certain stage, and then the exit strategy would be to sell it on, or to JV it, or those sorts of things, rather than go through the pain of trying to put these things in production. I don't have anyone on my board or anyone in the company with production experience. It's a whole different skill sets, and you certainly better know what you're doing before you embark on it. And there's a lot of junior companies that have gone bust trying to turn themselves into mid-tier producers. It can be a very, very difficult process, especially if you don't have any international contacts in the banking business to go out and get the money, because we're not talking about small money at that point. We're talking about hundreds of millions, maybe even billions of dollars that have to be raised to actually build the mine and build the infrastructure. That's not something that I want to do. I'd like to leave some money on the table for the next company to come in. It would be nice for the shareholders to retain a piece, but at the end of the day, we are a public company, and we're vulnerable to a takeover. And if a deal comes in that the shareholders like, that'll be it. The company will be sold on. So, and then I suppose I've got to hang up my boots for another 3 weeks or so before I start the next venture.
Well, certainly the big hunters are looking at elephant country, and you're in elephant country, so it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out.
Yes.
Keith, we really appreciate you sharing your thoughts and insights, wisdom with us today. We hope you come back soon.
Okay. Thanks so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure.